Good morning. I think we have our close to full contingent of subcommittee members present, so I guess we can get started. This is a subcommittee meeting on retained bill, House Bill 437, dealing with literacy. This subcommittee meetings are more informal. There might be some people in the audience who wish to speak, so we can entertain that. But first, I'd like to mention I've passed out an updated draft of HB 437. It is still a work in progress. We're still tweaking it, but we'll have the final amendment for our full committee session in November. So I'd like to first start with why went down the road with this legislation, and it really centers on what has happened or hasn't happened with reading across the country for a few decades. And if we look at NAEP scores, really can't see this too well, and I'm sorry I didn't have copies for everybody, but in fourth grade reading in New Hampshire in 1992, the NAEP achievement level in reading in the fourth grade was 38%. In 2022, it was 37%. In the eighth grade in 2009, in 2003, it was 40%. In 2022, it was 33%. So we are not making progress. I can try and get copies for everybody. This is a chart of proficiency scores in many of our schools, comparing reading proficiency in 2017, 18, 19, and 21. And I believe the current state average is something like 48.5 proficiency. So that, I think, demonstrates the need and the fact that really the Department of Education has been working very hard for several years in trying to change the focus of our literacy instruction in the state. Over the past decade, there's something like 26 states that have passed legislation revamping the way reading is taught in their states. And I have worked with some of people from those states, most notably a lady who was in charge of the legislation in Mississippi, where they have seen the most dramatic changes in proficiency rates in their schools. One of the things that the department has been doing is training in something called LETRS, and I know, Representative, you've been involved in that. But I was at a LETRS meeting on Friday, and updated numbers were mentioned that over 3,000 people in New Hampshire have now been trained via the LETRS program, which really centers on evidence-based reading practices in the science of reading. And they said that New Hampshire far is superior in what we're doing in this regard in the letters training to any other state in the country, which I thought was impressive. So I think what I'd like to do is go through the legislation, and there's a few copies out there if you want to follow along. But I highlighted several areas that I thought it was important to mention. And you'll see on the first page, number one is a universal reading screener for local district use. We are still talking about screeners and which screener, but I believe that there will be resources available for the state to help in providing readers to the local districts. And one change here that I think you'll see underlined on your page is that we're doing the screening in K through 3, but 3 times a year, beginning, middle, and end of the year. And some of these changes you'll notice, this is, for instance, in italics. And someone we've been working closely with is Dr. Tolman from New Hampshire, but she is co-author of the letters program. So I think it's been extremely valuable input for us to improve the legislation. And so it's 3 times a year, and you'll see some of the measurable skills that should be concentrated on down below that. Also, one of the other changes at the bottom of the page is that we believe the screener should be given within the first 40 school days of the year. And then also anyone coming into the school for the first time, if they haven't been, they're not coming with any information on their reading abilities, should be screened also within the first 40 days.
Rep. Critter,
Yes.
I don't think I got the same amendment because I'm looking at it thinking either I'm reading it wrong. It's I have a lag amendment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yes, good. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, totally different bill.
It is. Okay. This looks better.
Yeah, so if you turn over to the second page, Roman 3, you'll see a number 2. And this involves the development of an individual reading plan for those students who are not at an age-appropriate benchmark according to the screening. And it details what should be included in that plan, including goals and benchmarks, monitoring of progress. And I think one significant thing we did in F was to say that any instructional or intervention programs shall not use the 3 queuing method, which is the most prevalent method currently, really, I think around the state and in many states who have not moved to the science of reading, which involves the student trying to learn to read, getting cues rather than really using evidence-based research to sound out the word and figure out what the word is. Use cues like a picture to help them identify what the word is. So we don't want to continue using that framework for reading. But also I think important in the individual plan are strategies for the student parent to use. And that's one of the things that we try to incorporate into this. I think that if we're going to really have a broad literacy improvement program in the state, that everybody has to be involved. Parents for sure, but even a little bit further on, you'll see that local districts should engage the stakeholders in the community as to what is important and why we're doing all this. It's not included in this, but I have talked with the state librarian about future expansion of summer reading programs and things like that, possibly in the next biennium budget. So on to number 3, Roman 4. If there is a deficiency noted in the age-appropriate benchmarks, that the parent is notified within 14 days, within 2 weeks, about that. And you'll see there some of the things that should be discussed with the parent in that notification. Number 4 is Romans 6. This is where we get into the engagement of local stakeholders. We also specify that the department should hold periodic workshops for educators and parents as they are doing currently with the LETTERS program. But also the department should come up with guidance to the departments on evidence-based instructional materials so that the departments have a resource, at least to begin with, to see what they want to use in their schools. Number 5, each school district shall report annually about the progress, and you'll see there's 3 or 4 things listed there in terms of what has to be reported in these annual reports by the school district. I think that one of the problems or issues that we've seen for years with the differentiated aid that we had for 3rd grade reading, there was just money that went out to the district with no accountability or no information about progress other than that 1 year end of year report. So here we want to keep an eye on what is going on and how each school district is moving forward with the evidence-based reading practices. If turn the page, the department, I think, is also responsible for a report. And I think this is very important. We talk about the teacher preparation programs. And we can't do a whole lot as a state legislature to direct what the colleges are doing, but we can ask them to report on what they were doing. A couple of years ago, this group called the National Council on Teacher Quality, NCTQ, and they issued a major report on the movement toward the science of reading and evidence-based reading instruction. And it was interesting, they rated each of the schools who returned the surveys. And in New Hampshire, there were 4. And I'll read you the name of the school and the grade for 2023 that they were assigned based on their survey. Keene State got a B. Plymouth State got a D. Southern New Hampshire University got an F. And the University of New Hampshire got a D. So if the teacher preparation programs are not providing the necessary information to teachers coming out of those colleges, we're behind the 8 ball, and the students are behind the 8 ball to begin with. So what I did here, you'll see in G, Roman 11, is to take the same survey criteria that were used by the National Council, and we're going to ask the department to get the same information that they did from these colleges, looking at the components, including phonics and vocabulary and comprehension. But for each one of those, list the hours, the measures, how much opportunity there is to practice this, and the materials used by those colleges. The same criteria that National Council of Teacher Quality used. So I think that this is a major component that we've worked on over the summer that wasn't in the prior version. Going down to the next area, reading improvement grants. This is going to change a little bit because we missed out on passing something last year when we had the budget available to us to put in an appropriation. We are going to change this reading improvement grant section to more like a competitive grant situation, and we'll be working with the department to work that out, and then hopefully start these reading improvement grants in 2 years with the next budget with an appropriation there. And as you'll see in this, there's different grant amounts based on the grade level, thinking that it's going to be less expensive if we catch student deficiencies earlier, and it's going to be more expensive later. So if we're not aware of it until the 3rd grade, we have the highest grant amount award at that level. But in order to receive these grants, the district has to provide a plan on how the funds are going to be used to improve reading. An accountability measure that I think is important there. The next page, number 8, is the section of statutes that relate to literacy skills in the elementary schools. And some of the things in here that we've done is to make sure that we're moving toward evidence-based, reflective of science reading research, and the major components within that that you'll see listed. And also repeating that we are not going to be using the 3 cueing, the balanced literacy type of instruction that has been used for so long. And I think it's in that regard, it's interesting to note that that method of instruction was made popular by a scholar by the name of Lucy Calkins, who has recently backtracked from what she has been advocating for decades. And also interesting to note that the Columbia University has dissolved the program within the college that was used to promote this kind of instruction. So I think that recognition of where we have been that's not working and where we need to go that has proven results, I think is widely accepted. And one thing I also wanted to point out was in relation to the science of reading, and I can make copies of this. There are all sorts of lectures on YouTube about what's involved in, quote, the science of reading. But at one seminar that a couple of us went to, they talked about the reading brain. And I've seen pictures of kids being hooked up, with sensors all around their head and their brain to measure what is going on in the brain as they are trying to read. So that is what the reading brain is, and it talks about the different lobes of the brain and what happens in each as they're trying to read. So I'll make copies of this for everybody, but this and the research that has been done, this is what we're talking about with evidence-based science of reading research. And I think that's important to note as well. And the last section that I wanted to touch on was we last year passed House Bill 377, and that was signed into law. This legislation encompasses the dyslexia screening and instruction, as well as general reading literacy. And in doing so, it does several important things in my mind. One is the move to 3 screenings a year instead of just 2. And it also lessens the number of days required for screening to begin at the beginning of the year. So I think that we are taking another step forward in trying to ascertain where and when these children are having problems in learning to read and addressing them early on. And I do have copies, actually, for this is a page on the reading brain that I took from several sources, and I'll get these out to the audience. But also, this is the executive summary from the report I mentioned by the National Council on Teacher Quality, talking about what they found and going into more detail. For instance, I just opened this page. 2 out of 3 teacher preparation programs fail to adequately address phonemic awareness. And it goes on like that throughout each of the sections that they believe are important for this move to evidence-based research. So with that, I'll first open it up to the subcommittee members for any questions, and then ask for if there's anyone in the audience that would like to comment or ask a question. Any representative?
I'll kind of kick it off. So is this going strictly to phonetics, phonics? Phonics instead of at the exclusion. The thing that bothers me a little bit is that in several places you're excluding one particular technique that's been used, even though it may not be the most effective technique. It's been used for a long time. And I know just from my stint teaching that when new ideas came along like this and you had a big change, we went from whole language to it just stream of thought as far as language arts were concerned, and it kind of, there's a third of the kids that learn one way, third of the kids that learn another way, and a third of the kids that learn another way. And if you exclude one of those, you miss out on some of the students. And I'm just wondering if we have to put that it's excluded one particular way. Go ahead.
I've been doing a bunch of reading in preparation for this, and what I have read is that cueing theory is actually harmful even if used in conjunction with these other methods. That it messes up, I guess, the way a child learns reading, and that it shouldn't even be used in conjunction.
I think that children do learn differently, as we all know. But I think that the basics of what they found in all the research are these 5, 6, 7 components, and even some people at a seminar several of us were at, they talk about one missing component in some of this is knowledge. And the increase in proficiency they saw when there was 6 more months of social studies given to the students, because they had a greater knowledge base for the comprehension aspect, which is in here. On the first page, F is reading comprehension. So if you have a greater knowledge base, comprehension will increase also. So, yes, children learn differently, but I think that from the research, these are the basics that the experts have said should be present in their reading instruction. Yes.
Well, one of the things I found persuasive, what you just said a little while ago about this 3 cueing, is that one of the leading proponents of it, I can't remember what name, Lucy
Hawkins.
Right. So she, you would think, is an expert, and then she is kind of going back and saying it's not. So that to me is sort of persuasive as far as maybe this is.
And the fact that Columbia Teachers College is backtracking on years of supporting this type of instruction. But one of the problems still is that we have book publishers who are, trying to make a profit also. And they are still pushing this method of reading. And one of the biggest publishers of this is based here in New Hampshire. But I think with the movement that we've seen, as I said, 26 states in a decade moving in this new direction, I think that the publishers will get the message, and that will change.
So I noticed, since I had Representative Ladd's amendment before me, first of all, that he included mathematics, which I understand why you probably just want to do reading at this point. But he also had that it would apply to charter public schools, and public academies. And I'm wondering if in this bill it will include those particular sites as well.
And you will see often in the science of reading and this evidence-based approach, reading and mathematics. But I figured it was enough of a hill for me to climb just on the reading side of things.
Just as an aside, I think that we need to approach mathematics in a similar fashion.
Yes, and we did do a couple of things last year in regard to that. Yes, so yeah, definitely. Yeah, our math proficiency rates are know better.
Well, and we haven't really recognized that there's, a similar case to dyslexia, only with mathematics
Right.
so.
Just, you have to press the silver button so the red light goes on, and give us your name and position.
Good morning. My name is Brenda Peters. I am the immediate past president of the Northern New England International Dyslexia Association. We have been around for 18 years serving New Hampshire. We used to be called New Hampshire IDA, but because we represent Maine and Vermont, we were able to change our name about a year ago so that we have better representation in all of our states. I have been involved in this field for almost, 25 years, since my son, who is profoundly dyslexic, and we started this journey. Before that, I was in organizational development and moving along happily, and didn't even know that special education existed until my son struggled. So that started me on this journey. I'm now a reading specialist, and learning disability specialist and a specialist in the assessment of intellectual functioning. So I actually test children for dyslexia. And I was also the director of the Children's Dyslexia Center and affiliated with them for 18 years, teaching structured literacy. Structured literacy is the approach that we talk about when we think about the science of reading. And structured literacy includes not just phonics and phonemic awareness, it also includes vocabulary and building knowledge. And it is truly based on science. It's been around for 95 years, based on the work of Orton Gillingham, and then it's evolved from there. And what we know about reading and the acquisition of reading is that all children, in fact, the brain processes information the same, and we all learn to read the same way. And that is by understanding and making that paired association between the sound system of language and the written system of language. And children who struggle have difficulty with the sound system of language that becomes apparent when they're very young, even 3, 4, 5-year-olds. We can effectively identify these struggling readers, which is why we have bills like this in so many places. Children do not learn by the 3 cueing system, which involves visual, semantic, and syntactic information, using those first before going to decoding the word and getting the word off the page. Now, what people are attracted to about 3 cueing is that, and balanced literacy, is that the belief was teach rich information and the child will learn to read. Teach them the knowledge, build knowledge, and they will learn to read. It doesn't work. We've been trying that for decades in all of our states. It doesn't work. And when we have 65% of our children not reading at a proficient level, but only 15% of the children are actually dyslexic, we have a tier 1 instructional problem. And the answer is structured literacy, which addresses all of those needs. So that's my 2 cents. But thank you. I think this bill is really important. I think it's a great beginning, but I do think that we need to do all we can to make sure that our teachers who are spending over $100,000 to become teachers walk out of UNH and can teach any child, including those who struggle to read. If they can't, then what does this, this degree mean? One of the main purposes of our children going to public school is to learn to read. And if the teacher can't leave that with the ability to teach all children, then I think we have a problem. And in Mississippi, they required the professors to take letters and to learn about our language. And you would think, well, of course they're learning this in college. They're not. So yeah, we need to back up the bus, and we also need to look at our state and federally funded colleges, and what are we doing there to get that information out?
Thank you. Any
Yes.
questions from the subcommittee? Thank you. Anyone else like? Sure, Representative.
Good morning, and thank you for taking on this important subject with the children. I'm Representative Ball. I am a reading specialist, although it's now lapsed because I became a state, but I was certified as a reading specialist in New Hampshire as well as a special education teacher. Just to touch on a few things, you were talking about the colleges, and I will tell you that when I became a reading specialist, I had no idea that was a general education certificate. And many of us sitting at the table were like, well, when are we going to learn our specialized instruction on how to teach reading? We never were taught. It is up to the teacher to take it upon herself or himself to then go ahead and get certified in a specialized instruction. Most schools don't even offer it. That was just to kind of touch on that. I'm also concerned, literacy is including math. And so it concerns me that I do believe we need to have a firm definition in New Hampshire of what exactly literacy is. And it does include math. And it's easy to define that by just looking at how we identify students for special education in specific learning disabilities, because that is literacy. And it does include math, and it also includes spelling. So my concern here is that it often mentions, when I look, it says a lot of decoding fluency, but there's nothing about encoding. And oftentimes what I have learned, and I also have been fighting this battle for 30 years to try and get phonics back into the classroom, is that oftentimes children can easily memorize. Our children with dyslexia tend to be average to above average IQ. They teach themselves, they compensate, and so they can easily memorize these words. However, when you ask them to spell them, that's where you can find that they don't know the rules, they don't understand how the sounds work. And speaking of sounds, dyslexia is an auditory disability. So it often goes from generation to generation. So they must be taught these sounds. It is not innate, it has to be broken down and taught to them. Looking at the bill, another thing that I notice is often it says age appropriate, and I personally would like to see that as grade appropriate, because sometimes parents will choose to hold a child back. Oftentimes it is boys who tend to act a little bit less mature. So we really should be looking at where should they be in this grade, not in their age. That would be another just something that I would change. I know that Representative Cordelli was very nice. We spoke last year about this bill, and I did mention the part about making meaningful gains to lessen the that section there. That is language that's from special education law, and I really thought it should be included in this, because we're not just looking for progress. We do need to look for meaningful gains. We need to see that the gap is lessening. My feedback for that is we need to put a time frame. Response to intervention is not supposed to go on forever. It is supposed to be a quick, let's see if we can close the gap. It should go 8 to 12 weeks. After that, the child should be referred to special education, and they should rule out a disability. There should be an idea that there could be a problem if the there could be a disability if the child is not picking up on the interventions. The other thing I would like to mention is there's also oftentimes we have to wait for the child. There's physiological changes that happen in the brain. And so the idea that children are going to read at 6 is really not going to happen for all children. Some children, it may be 8 years old. They could still be reversing letters and numbers. They're still not just putting it together. And then once it clicks, when their brain is ready to accept it, they will. So I think we do need to make sure we're not putting so much pressure on a child when they they just can't do it yet, but we need to be aware of that and provide accommodations while we are waiting for their brain to develop to the point that they can accept what we're teaching them. Let's see. I believe
If I could
that's-
just,
Sure, I believe that's just my feedback. I'm sorry, because I just see
No,
this
no,
now,
that's-
so I'm
yeah,
kind of
right.
like all over the place.
I just wanted to mention, in terms of timeframes for special ed referral, we've danced around that issue with a number of people as to should there be 8 to 12 weeks, or what should the time frame be, or if we're specifying a shorter time frame, are we pushing the child into a special ed categorization? So that's something that we've danced around with, and I think maybe that dance will continue until November.
I will say that that is one of my biggest concerns and has always been a concern of mine for the last 15 years since I've been certified as a teacher or as a specialty reading specialist. That is a huge pitfall in the special education law. It specifically says that the school districts can use and exhaust all interventions that they can try and throw at the student. It could go on for 2 years. Meanwhile, that child is behind for 2 years. There needs to be a way of shortening that up. In 2011, the Commissioner of the United States Department of Education sent out a letter, and I can get you a copy of it, but in that letter, she specifically said that referrals to special education cannot be deferred or delayed because a child is going to be in response to intervention, RTI. That if you suspect a disability, you are to refer that child to special education. Now that happens, but the problem is you go to your referral meetings and the school says, well, we want to try X, Y, and Z. Well, at some point, X, Y, and Z has to end, because if it doesn't, we're just prolonging and keeping that child in a classroom where they can't access the curriculum. And oftentimes, it could be a child now in second grade, and they're still waiting to get referred for special education. I've seen that happen multiple times, even within my own family. So I do think we need to tighten up that federal law. As a state, we can tighten it up as a state and say, well, the federal law might say that, but in New Hampshire, we hold our schools to a higher standard. We want our children, we want to rule out learning disabilities as soon as possible, or get them into a more intensive reading program.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any questions from anyone? Representative Tanner.
Is there anything in this, I know you talk about bringing in stakeholders and parents, and but a lot of reading instruction goes on in the home early, and a lot of parents are not really, not a lot, but a number of parents are not proficient readers themselves, and maybe just don't have the time to spend with the child, or for whatever reason, but some of it is that they just don't know. And it seems to me one of the things we could do in this bill is at least put in something about, and I know we're out of the money issue, but that local schools should offer instruction for parents, not required instruction for parents, but the offer of having forums or seminars at schools that parents could take for, the state would cover it.
Yes, thank you. I did try and address that to a degree in terms of the individual plan that's developed for the student would include strategies that would be given to the parent. But also, I did say that the department should offer periodic workshops for educators and parents. So I think you're absolutely correct in terms of the information and the instruction capabilities being provided to parents, and that's why I'm looking forward to, in the future, working with the state librarian and advancing what and how the libraries can help in that regard as well.
If I could just make one more comment on that.
Sure.
I believe the letters program was actually open to parents as well to take. I also took the letters training, and it is a very basic training. It's not a certification. The problem or the challenge with that is, as long as we have Fontes and Pinnell in our school districts, in our state, letters is of no use because Fontes and Pinnell is a scripted program and the teachers are expected to be on the same place on the same day across. So if you have 3 first grades classrooms in your district, all 3 are expected to be on the same page every single day, and you stick to the script. You're not to deviate. So even with all the letters training, the teachers' hands are tied. Thank you very
Correct,
much.
yes. Yeah, I tried to take a step toward requiring the move to the evidence-based research types of instruction. I went as far as I could in that regard, but I'm sure that the department will be offering further guidance in the department and technical advisories, et cetera, in the future as well.
Yeah, the questions I'm sitting here listening to this, would there be any value in inviting representatives of the teacher education institutions for this subcommittee to hear their side or their approach or lack thereof in teaching of reading based upon the information that's been shared this morning?
I believe, we could do that. I have talked to Mr. Appleby from the department about teacher preparation and so forth. So I could possibly ask him to contact some of those institutions. Yes.
You have. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. Definitely they have the knowledge base. And I've only been out of the field for 2 years, but after teaching reading and overseeing special ed referrals and whatnot, I too have a strong opinion about how reading should be taught, and no 2 children, can use the same method, but yet we seem to buy programs that are scripted and they just don't meet the needs of all the kids. I'm a firm believer in the Jim Collins good to great schools. No matter what those reading scores are, we should always be in improvement mode. I don't care if it's 60%, 40%, whatever it is. So I'm coming from that realm. One of the things about this bill is it has a lot of strengths, and I'm very happy to see that you've moved language to evidence-based reading. As far as I'm concerned, 3 queuing system shouldn't even be a language that's on paper. I don't know if it works or it doesn't, but if you've been in education, like some of these people, the pendulum swings from one extreme to the other, and it never just goes in the middle. But if you can make your school district so that people have the skills and know how to draw from the toolbox to be able to address each of the children's needs, then that's what we need to give teachers and schools. But you need to have a hierarchy that's going to go after that and not just the current book on the market, really. So I come from a lot of experience. I did look a little bit more from teacher prep, so it's been, I don't want to say how many years since I've been out of college, but as an elementary major, secondary and elementary major, I did have to take foundations of reading to learn the different programs for different types of learners, and I did have to take a course in diagnostic screening and intervention. Now, I don't know if they still provide that, but I would say because of what we know in reading, those programs should be much more robust. I know that they have to take the Praxis 1, whether they're at UNH or Plymouth. Those are the 2 schools I just randomly picked out. They have to take, at an elementary major, they have to also take a Foundations of Reading test to move on and get certified, and the Praxis 2. So something in that realm should be more robust and based on evidence-based reading strategies. I'm a big proponent of that, having worked in reading over many years. I'm glad to see the Bible that I've adjusted. Dr. John Savage worked out at Boston University. He was from Massachusetts, wrote a book, Understanding Reading Problems, did a lot of training with a lot of people, and it has been my Bible. The other piece that is not new to the market, as I think the reading specialist mentioned, was the response to intervention model. So it was a 3-tier model. And I think what has gone by the wayside is the fact that schools are really not engaging in data teams. And that's where you don't have somebody going on 2 years in an intervention and then you say, oh, maybe now I need a referral. No, it's really prescriptive in, all right, you provide an intervention for 6 weeks, you measure the progress. You provide an intervention, you measure the progress. And from what I understand, in one of my districts, they no longer do data teams, which really made the difference in reading progress or not. But definitely still the response to intervention is the model in terms of tertiary services. And we had a very strong Title I reading program, and they were always current. But Dottie Fair was at the department back then, and they were always current in what was the right method, and it wasn't always what was being advertised. And districts get sucked into that pretty easily because companies offer a lot of freebies if you buy their program, but you have to keep an open mind. And again, I come from a district that had no money, so we didn't buy the program of the jour, and we didn't go whole language. But neighboring districts would go whole language. We didn't believe in it because kids need phonics. Sure enough, evidence-based reading says they have to have phonics, and they have to have phonemic awareness, and those 5 components. I would stick to those. I'm concerned about your time limit and your benchmarks. I don't disagree with them. Yes, they need to be beginning, middle, and end for every student to make sure they're on that trajectory. But again, in between beginning, middle, and end, in between time, those kids who are not making that progress need to be picked up. Maybe the principal certification programs need to have specialized coursework in reading because they should know, not only just a special educator, but the administrator should know, all right, why don't you, based on what we're seeing in this data team, this student might need Lindamood or this student might need a Wilson, depending on how that goes. So it leaves, and I think that if we could focus on the evidence-based reading strategies, we don't want to take away local control. And I'm placing a lot of value now on the department having a reading specialist because somebody needs to lead this charge. And that's where it needs to be. I mean, I'm glad to see Dibbles is out of here, though I trained in Dibbles and used it many times, but in the field now, they're using more prescriptive, different types of assessments, and I don't think we should be talking about, again, a specific program or company name. Letters, I did train in letters as well. It's one tool in the toolbox. It's not the whole gamut, but the evidence-based strategies, the 5 readings, that's the key. I think once, if we can get guidance at the state level in terms of how to disseminate and make sure that every district does that, the benchmarking will happen. It has to. I don't think you need the time limit because that will override it. Because if you're going to show improvement, you better do it, at certain intervals. I think when there was a recommendation or there was a reading specialist initially hired and then it went to an English language arts consultant, that person put together this wonderful guide. I don't remember the year of it, resource guide for dyslexia and other related resources. I don't remember the year, 2016-17. And before that was the National Reading Panel in 2005, okay? And so I don't like the term science of reading simply because it's the term of the day, or I would say the term of the jour. What is really key here is those 5 evidence-based strategies, whether you call it science of reading or reading first, it's what it is, right? So that's a good thing, and I'm glad that that has persisted over almost 20 years because it's sound. So I think it needs some work. I think we should focus on the evidence-based strategies. Maybe throw in some data team requirement. What was some of the other things I had? The department also has a website called New Hampshire Loves Reading, I think it's called, or something to that effect. You've probably seen it. I would like to see some YouTube videos on there for parents and teachers. Quick little snippets. How do I help my child that's struggling in, phonemic awareness, putting sounds together? Well, use a Slinky. I'm having trouble, my kids are having trouble with ending sounds. Well, here's some tools you could use. I mean, you don't need to buy a book. I mean, exposure to language helps children read, right? And the big thing that I am concerned about when you get talking about a referral for special ed versus waiting or providing intervention is kids have to come to school in kindergarten reading some basic words already. Or they used to come to first grade reading basic words. But we have lots of kids from rural communities that don't have that pre-learning. And those kids, unless they've been exposed to learning, you can't sift through whether it's a disability or not. And so that's why you got to have somebody skilled in knowing, the difference between the achievement, the ability. So that's a very fine line. 9 times out of 10, I'd go with the parent. If the parent wants a referral, then let's start giving a cognitive test. That's all you need to start with. And then let's sift it out. But you need to rule it out for peace of mind of the parent as well. I like no commercial programs. I don't like any buzzwords like science or reading. Trying to think what else. And the reading specialist at the Department of Ed, I'm hoping we've got some foundations already in place. I think it needs to go to the next level of requiring the data team parts. What bothers me about this bill in particular, as a rep, I'm trying to represent all my constituents. This doesn't represent all kids. Don't we want all our kids to learn how to read? Somehow that should be in there. I mean, right?
Do you have suggestions on how to emphasize that? And any thoughts you have, you can send to me. I'm open to suggestions. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, aren't all kids supposed to have the ability to do the state assessment, which has a reading component? It's once a year. But you would want to know any student. To me, it doesn't matter the level of progress as long as there's progress in terms of kids that I don't have control over. But you need to know, otherwise you're going to be losing a population. And it's not right.
If I could just touch on a couple of things you mentioned.
Yep.
In terms of the data and data teams, the professional development session I went to was down in Londonderry, and they had an assistant superintendent who was the presenter talking about data-driven and the way they do it in their district. It was to a very, very fine detail. The spreadsheets that the teachers had to keep were extensive, and I heard some feedback that the amount of time that it would take a teacher to
It is time
input
consuming.
all that information that they wanted into the spreadsheet. So that's a balancing point, I guess. But I have looked at some systems of assessment that do build a lot of that data for the teacher based on the assessment.
Yep.
So I think that that's something that department should take into account. But also on the instructional side, a number of states have said to their districts you will use one of these, 6 or 7 programs of instruction, which I wasn't going there. So in talking with the department, we said the department will offer guidance on research-based instructional materials, and we left it at that.
And obviously that to me, it makes more sense than as a legislator, I shouldn't be interfering in local control and I shouldn't be interfering in a government mandate. I mean, it's the right thing to do to force this evidence-based reading. And that's pretty much it.
Yes, Representative.
Work to be done.
Okay, well, kind of relates to what Representative Cascadden was saying about addressing the needs of all readers or all students. This is only pertaining to those, this whole bill really pertains to those who exhibit a deficiency. So then I'm getting back to like this one thing that seems to be emerging as a big negative is that 3 queuing system of reading and not having it for these deficient students and their, the attempt to address their needs. So then ultimately it seems like you want fewer kids being deficient. If you continue to teach the 3 queuing system that's inefficient, are you going to be not addressing the needs of readers? They will then become deficient. Does that make any sense when I'm saying that if you continue to do the 3 queuing, which is inefficient with the students not addressed by this bill, right, in kindergarten, first, second, third, that then you will have more deficient readers, that then the percentages that you were citing about like NAEP scores, for instance, and how low proficiency is. I mean, ultimately, you want to address that and get that even lower. So I don't know if I'm getting my point across, but it's the idea of
Let me take a stab at it.
Yeah, just brainstorming here.
I think we tried to go in that direction by saying it had to be all students screened in K through 3. And it was 3 times a year. Last year, when we were discussing this, there was some feedback that, if let's say in first grade, the student didn't show deficiencies, then they wouldn't have to be assessed anymore. But people I talked to said you can mask that by using the queuing methods and et cetera, so that we wanted to keep doing the assessments so that we would catch those students and not have their solutions mask real deficiencies in reading. I took that approach in here. But any more ideas on how to make sure that this is impacting all students, glad to discuss.
My question was along those lines, and I was just wondering where specifically you were seeing that not all kids were being reached by this, so that we could make sure that they are. So where is the downfall, I guess, that you're seeing?
Do you mean the 3 queuing system?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, you said
Evidence-based?
not all kids would be, reached.
Right.
And I guess I didn't get that out of here, so I'm wondering where you're getting that. So yes, all kids should be reached.
Well, some kids attend learning centers, some kids take online classes, some kids have different types of learning programs, non-public schools,
I see. So
more non-public.
I see
Yeah.
what I see what you're
We've
saying.
got the bulk of the kids in public
Yeah.
schools, but we do have a large number
Right.
in non-public, a variety. I don't know specifics, but, and I just want to bring up the NAEP scores. There isn't anything in student learning that did not go down during the COVID years. So I wouldn't place a whole lot of value, not that they're not accurate, they probably are, but I wouldn't base all of it on what kids did during COVID, because if you've worked with any kids during that time, you know they turned it right off. I don't care what age level. However, I mean, I think you had a 2003 data point of 40% at what, grade 8 or grade 4, wasn't sure. But it was a few years after that that the National Reading Panel came out with their research, and I'd be curious to see if there was any increase after that. Now, if you read about reading first at the national level, it was a total debacle because of corruption at the top. But us little peons down in the little districts had some benefit of a lot of dollars. But again, we're talking about evidence-based reading. And the state also had a really strong, when Title I was more focused on reading, and then it slowly picked up math, and now it can fund behavioral specialists or other types of services. When it was primarily reading based, the state had a Granite State Reading Association, and then every region in the state had a chapter. And those entities were very active in the field, to the point of having New England Reading Association did regional conferences. And I presented at those conferences, and we've learned from other districts around New England. And so that structure, I don't think exists anymore. So there was more of an emphasis, and there was more of a support system around teaching reading. Now there's been so many offshoots. I mean, we have to deal with social emotional behavior. I mean, go figure, right? Our job is to teach reading, teach math. And so something had to go. I'm not saying, I'm just thinking about it out loud now. It's like, obviously something must have gone.
I think the whole community has to be involved in this if we're going to get to where we want to be. So that's why I did want the districts to engage with local stakeholders, and also just initial discussions with the state librarian about, expanding the work of libraries. That's, I think, an ongoing discussion. Yeah. Representative Tanner.
I think another discussion has to be integrating literacy into all the other courses. Particularly, there's a strong connection between music and physical education and literacy, and probably art as well. So, when we start getting programs and we start blocking out things because we have to devote so much energy to something else, that and I know a lot of places cut back on physical education, just went to, open playtime, undirected playtime, and literacy, there is a very strong connection there. So, in the same way with music and art. So I just want to make that pitch.
Thank you. Anyone else like to? Yes.
Hi there. My name is Bibi Casey, and I'm from New London. I wasn't planning to speak today, but I'm actually getting text messages from somebody who's watching it live stream, and she wanted me to share these comments. And her name is Christine Downing, and she was the curriculum director at the Kearsarge district up until last year, and now she's currently a curriculum director for, I think it's Grantham, Plainfield, and Enfield, and very knowledgeable on this, and I commend her for the programming that she created at Kearsarge. Very detailed screening protocols, lots and lots of data. I was a school board member at the time, so she would present to us quite frequently. So her comment here that I'll read to you is, I would offer that have we done any alignment to the state assessments to key phonics elements? The poor performance on these assessments is a linchpin in this discussion. However, state assessments and reading don't typically give us the kind of data we need to properly inform this need and process. The state assessment should be a key first step in supporting proper data gathering related to phonics instruction. Currently, we get scores only on craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas, and key details about informational and literary text. If state results are the driver, then start with looking at state assessment design, which is the purview of RSA 193C. And she also has a comment about, I'd like to know how the bill aligns to RSA 193E, which provides parameters in terms of the role of the state versus local control, which I think you've been talking a little bit about. And she also asks if it might be possible to hold a roundtable discussion to get some information about what is happening and not happening in schools. I know, Representative Cordelli, that you've been reaching out to a lot of folks and having a lot of conversations, and I'm sure you all have been doing the same. And finally, I just want to thank you for all of the work you've done on this. I've been around for a while working on all of this legislation, and it really makes me feel so good that these discussions are happening. They weren't happening 7, 8 years ago when we passed the first dyslexia law. I have seen so much improvement, and I thank you all for your work on this. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those comments.
It just made me think also whether the department has a Title I consultant in terms of professional development. I don't know if there's somebody here from the
Yes.
department?
Ms. White, if you'd like to.
I'm Kathleen McCaffrey, your new. Sorry, is that working? Yes, Kathleen McCaffrey, the reading consultant for the Department of Ed, moved into that role recently. And you had a question about Title I. We do have a Title I in our department. Any other questions? No.
Did you have any comments, suggestions on what you heard this morning?
I think it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your thoughts, and interested to see how it continues. Thank you. Yes.
Based on what the last person said, and being part of the state, are you looking at the state assessment to see if there are changes that need to be made based on phonics, et cetera?
Nate, you want to come up? Are we looking at the state assessment in regards to phonics?
And these other things that we're trying to make sure are being taught now? Are we following that up with the state assessment?
There's a variety of things we can look at in terms of like STEM score reporting, state assessment. Normally, the large things we report out on are just larger subjects of reading and writing, and we can dive deeper into that data. So if that's some analysis that this committee would like to see, we can certainly provide that.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
I think there's someone else with a hand up. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Karen LaPlante, and first of all, I want to thank you all for all the work that you do. I was fortunate enough to be at a professional development opportunity where Representative Cordelli was there, and I learned about his work on this bill. And I am a reading specialist. I'm actually a special education reading specialist at a middle school right now. But I've worked, this is my first year at the middle school, but prior to that, I was in elementary for 12 years, both as a special educator and as a special education reading specialist. I was fortunate enough when I started my schooling, towards the end of my bachelor's degree, I connected with Beth McClure, who was essential in putting together the last dyslexia bill. And I worked at her charter school, and I was trained in Norton Gillingham right from the get-go. So I've been working with struggling readers for many, many years, and they are near and dear to my heart. So this bill is very important to me and very important to the students that I serve and that we as teachers and specialists serve. So I thought I would just, I had a little mix up on the dates, so I don't have anything formally prepared, but I do want to just speak to the components of the bill a little bit. I see that there are a few major components. The universal screener, I know we've talked about a little bit, and I just wanted to talk about the importance of it. I've worked in schools for many years that don't have a universal screener, and it's very difficult for students who are struggling, whether they are struggling and they're just under the cusp or they are really struggling, to be identified. I don't mean special education identification, I mean just looked at so that they don't slip through the cracks. The universal screener helps ensure that kids are not slipping through the cracks. Having it done 3 times a year is essential because when you do it at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, you have no midpoint to guide you to say, this is working or this isn't, we need to tweak it, we need to change it. So I'm very happy to see that the 3 times a year is written into this bill. Also, as far as the accountability piece, I found with the dyslexia law that we had in the past, although it was very good and I was very thrilled to have it, it didn't really have that accountability piece. And I don't think that the accountability piece should be in there to, be, punitive to schools. I think that it's there because schools need districts to recognize what's going on. At the district level needs to recognize what's going on in the schools so that they can guide them and help them, right? And then the state needs to be able to recognize what's going on in the district so that the state can guide and help the district. So I think that accountability piece is very important. And at the school level, which I've seen assessments being carried out and, laws that are put in place be followed. But when you don't have that accountability piece in place, administration and even teachers, they don't know what to do with the data after that, right? They don't necessarily know the steps that need to be taken after that. So I think by having the accountability piece in there, it's very important. The science of reading-based methods and materials component that's in the bill right now, that speaks from, I noticed that, the screener is K-3, which I think is very appropriate. The materials are K-5, right? So all throughout elementary school and really in middle school as well, students should be taught with, methods and materials that align with the science of reading, not just up until 3rd grade. So I'm glad to see that that's in there up until 5th grade. One of the problems that we have now in schools is that there's a great disconnect between methods and materials that are used at the tier 1 level, which is, your whole classroom instruction, and what is used at a tier 2 or a tier 3 level. And ideally, we would have those methods and materials aligned at each level. Students do all learn to read in the same way, but students who struggle need more of those science of reading-based methods. As you were speaking of, those are very important components. They need more time at the tier 2 level. At the tier 3 level, they need even more time. But they still need that evidence-based, explicit, cumulative, systematic instruction. I'm not seeing that now. I think a lot of schools, and certainly in my experience specifically, are still using Lucy Calkins materials. So it's been out. The information is there that these are not effective. It's been out for a few years now, but it's really just come to a head most recently. And schools, I think, are kind of stuck. And they need that guidance from the state to help them to know what they should be using and help with funding so that they can actually attain these materials. And I would be thrilled to see that happening in schools. It's very difficult for the elementary schools to move away from that Lucy Calkins materials. It's a giant overhaul for schools, and again, they need support in doing so. I also have to say that the 3 queuing system is something that I've actually seen firsthand harming students. Working at the tier 3 level for many, many, many years, I have students that will come into me and all they know how to do is guess at words. And it's so sad. And it takes so much time for me to turn that around and break those bad habits that they've been taught. And the other sad piece is I spend so much time and energy and heart and soul into providing good instruction for these struggling readers. And they leave my room and they go back to class and they're told to guess at the words. So for them to make progress, it's very difficult as it is because they have, whether they have a reading disability or whether they have some other disability or circumstance that's causing them to be behind, to have that disconnect between their intervention and their classroom instruction really harms them. The last piece, well, two more things I wanted to say. As far as the meaningful gains, I agree with that students need to be making meaningful gains. I would like to see some time frame around that as far as how long kids are in an intervention at the tier 2 level before they get referred for special education, because I too have seen students in tier 2 much too long. And we're not necessarily, first off, using the right materials, may not have teachers who are highly trained to be working with those students, but also they need to be able to move on to special ed or have the proper tweaks to their instruction to help them improve and move along in their reading. Last thing I wanted to mention was the teacher prep programs. I do have some personal experience with that because my daughter is in a teacher prep program at the moment at a school here in New Hampshire, and they were teaching both methods, balanced literacy and instruction lined with the science of reading. And they really wanted to stay true to that middle ground. She knew better. She's in the letters training. She has me. Her roommate, she just told me the story a couple of days ago. Her roommate said to her, you know, I think I'm going to go, she's a elementary ed major as well. And she said, you know what, I think I'm going to go with that balanced literacy approach. The science of reading approach, there's so much terminology and I just don't get all that, digraphs, syllable types, this, that, and the other thing. And my daughter had to kind of stop her in her tracks, you know, and say, wait a minute, all your kids are not going to learn to read if you go that route. So that's kind of where we are with our teacher prep. And I believe that's all I had, but I appreciate your time and the work that you've all put in to this bill.
Thank you very much for coming in and your comments. Would you take a question?
Sure.
Oh, no, not necessarily
Oh,
a question. for
okay.
her, just, and thank you. What comes to mind is I'd be curious to know if we can get this data, is how many elementary schools use a universal screener to start with? I mean, I haven't had experience with a district that has not, and obviously that's only 3 districts. But I can tell you that 3Qing has not north of the notch. But NWEA is a popular one. Ames Web is another one. I think some are moving towards Acadience. But I would be curious to see which elementary schools don't use a universal screener. And if it's a lot, that's pretty concerning. Something fell somewhere pretty hard.
I think the universal screener is where we have to start. You know, that's a very important starting point.
Yeah. And like I say, I haven't experienced a district that didn't have one. So obviously it's an issue somewhere.
We can try and follow up.
Yep. Thank you.
But I thank you very much for coming in for everybody. I think there's no more discussion. The subcommittee will subsequent meeting, follow up on a couple of things, possibly looking at state assessment on the progress there, as well as doing teaching prep programs. So we'll link those two areas in our next subcommittee meeting, and I'll be in contact shortly about trying to schedule that. Great. Thank you very much. So I guess that ends our subcommittee, and we'll get out of the way for the next one. Another subcommittee on this. Oh, this one is subcommittee.
Mostly all you want to do is take a nap. Did you like the what? Did you like I wanted to stay in, yeah, but like always. It's a big, yeah, the store, yeah, they were just.
Yeah.
Yeah, my son's at Dartmouth and it was parents' weekend, so he just wanted to get.
Okay, I'd like to go ahead with the meeting we have scheduled for 11 o'clock, seeing it's a little bit after that at this time. The meeting is SB 266, and as you recall, 266 was a fairly lengthy bill, dealt with a number of components of statute from Chapter 193C, E, H, and K. And it was like 22 pages in length, and we met several times regarding that. So here we are today dealing with 266. We have, I received from the department, I'm glad Nate and Caitlin are here, a request to make some changes to certain areas of statutes that within, that I've just mentioned, to support the ESSA application process, which we go through. Does everybody have a copy of the amendment that was on the table over there? There's extra copies right here. Anybody that doesn't, we'll pass them. Everybody have the amendment right here? Nate, they're all up here. Yeah, come on up and get them. You're welcome. So let me try to explain what went on here in the last, several weeks prior to filing, prior to the 11th deadline in September through the 15th. I did receive 2 requests from the department, from Dr. Green, Bureau Administrator, for looking at the accountability and assessment areas within legislation. And there were 2 areas. I took them both down to legislative services to try to get them put into legislation. And their response to me was, you have a bill that's exactly incorporating much of this already there in the name of SB 266 that was put forth by the Senate, of course, by Senator Ward, and had just a whole boatload of areas within it that we struggled with. So they said, if you really want to do something, you're best just going back and modifying what you've got in front of you to reflect the amending language, or reflect what's been presented. And so what I'd like to do, because we are going to be looking at SB 266, I'd like to invite both Nate and Caitlin up, if you would, please. And as we go through it, there may be questions regarding this. And so we'll just look to you for those responses rather than having to call you back and forth, back and forth. Do you both have a copy of this? Okay, great. Okay, I've had some email discussions with Nate since this, and I think what we have in front of you is what, I put forward to the legislative services last week. So if we could, we can start going, this amending language deals with components from 193C and 193H. It doesn't have anything to deal with the adequacy formula in 193E, nor does it have anything to do with 193K. So with that, on the first page, we'll look at the first page of the amendment right now. And you can go down and see the first change here on this is when we're dealing with program goals and assessments for 193C:3. There's a change on line 21, scratching out the word other and writing open-ended performance tasks. This area A, B, C, and D are in reaction to what you have in line 16. The assessment instrument shall include, but not be limited to, these components of the statewide assessment. So, Nate, you've crossed out other and incorporated in there under 22 other items types, et cetera. Could you explain maybe a little bit why that change is necessary?
Yes. Oh, thank you. I know red makes me think mute. So there are a couple of items that we've developed over the last 3 to 4 years that are on the state assessment that I would say don't really fall into one of the first 3 categories there. And those are things called item clusters. We use them primarily on our state science assessment. And it's a way of more authentically assessing students' understanding of science by presenting a scenario to a student where they actually have to interact with the scenario. So that could include some type of digital experiment where there are 2 or 3 variables and the students can actually look at the different variables and change those. And then there's a set of 4 to sometimes 7 questions that all relate to what the student is doing by interacting with that simulation on the test. We call those item clusters, and we wanted to put in here other item types because that wasn't an item type that existed when we first wrote the statute. We hadn't really developed it, and it didn't fit into one of these categories. So this 4th category, D, just kind of gives us the freedom to explore different ways of assessing student understanding on a test that may not fit into one of the 3 buckets within statute.
Thank you. Are there any questions on that change? I think Dr. Green really explained that pretty thoroughly. Okay, let's go on down to lines 26. Now, this is the language we have in law where there's an assessment required. And as you recall from federal legislation, we are required to test in grades 3 through 8 and one time in the high school. Could you please explain what you've done with this part right here on lines 26 down through going on to the next page on to line 4 on the next page?
Sure. So the original statute talked about how the state had to test once in an elementary school grade and once in a middle school grade. So we had crossed that piece out and added the language in that we're testing in grades 3 through 8, just to make our current statute consistent with our practice and with federal requirements right now. I think that language was just a holdover from older statute that was prior to ESSA. I guess is probably pre-2015 or so. And it just doesn't match what we've been doing over the last really 9 years. If we flip to the second page, it does note that in science specifically, science is only tested in grades 5, 8, and 11. So math and ELA are the 2 subjects that are in each of the grades 3 through 8 and 11. Science is just 3 grades statewide.
Thank you. I noticed that there's one component within there which has changed, that the local district had the ability to do an assessment in consultation with the department, not having to gain their approval. How many districts were doing that
None.
other than PACE?
And I would say, so PACE was under the approval of the Department of Education. It was authorized by the U.S. Department of Education. We had to get a what's called a 1241 waiver to allow schools to do the PACE program. And what we did on the second page on lines 5, 6, and 7, we've added some language in there that still gives the authority for local districts to pursue alternative means of assessment by going through the department and the U.S. Department of Education. The reason we've added that in there is by going that process, schools are still able to access all of their federal title funds. If a school were to choose an entirely separate assessment without going through either the New Hampshire Department of Education or the U.S. Department of Education, they would not be able to continue to receive their federal title funds. So they could do it. They could, I think you and I have talked about the Iowa Test of Basic Skills as a possible assessment. A school could adopt that, but if they don't do it through the steps authorized by the U.S. Department of Education, they wouldn't be able to continue to receive their title funding. So it's just a trade-off there. And we tried to specify that within the statute so that we still have a means for providing schools to go through that approval process and be able to use an alternative assessment and also still keep all their federal title funds.
You see, for the committee, the way we had it before, they could use the Iowa or California Achievement Test, another norm referenced achievement test, and consider that part of the statewide assessment program, but it conflicted with their receiving federal dollars if it was contrary to what the state is using for all. They can still do the Iowa test or a Gates-McKennedy test or something else on top of what they do on the statewide assessment if they want, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for being here. Could you define for us how many public academies do we currently have in the district?
Sure, yeah. So there's only 2 public academies. One is Pinkerton Academy, which is actually where my kids go, so I'm very familiar with that particular school. And the other one is Co-Brown in Northwood.
And we also tuition to St. Johnsbury Academy.
Yes.
Yes. Representative Bannon.
Thank you. So on line 22 on page 1, no, on line 27 on page 1, you expressly said charter public schools, and public academies. And yet in this one, you're talking just a school district. Should it be consistent?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so we just put in the language that charter school, academy, public school, right there where it says district.
Yeah. So I believe you're talking about line 5 on page 2.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that should mirror the language from the first page. Yes.
Okay. Good catch.
And again, the reason for that is all 3 of those categories of schools receive title funds. So they're required federally to participate in the statewide assessment program.
Okay. There's no other changes on that page 2 other than changing some of the Roman numerals. No, I guess there's no changes there. And then going over to page 3 here. Let me make sure we don't get that. On page 3, we're talking, once again, we're now 193C11, where it says, for the purposes of public reporting, the state shall use a minimum N size of 11 to maintain student data privacy. Was that 10 before?
No, so it's been 11 since the authorization of ESSA. It may have even been 11 during No Child Left Behind, I'm not sure. But I do know since we first adopted our state plan in 2016-17, it's been 11.
A little more information on that. We have historically used 11 throughout reporting, but we had to define it in our ESSA plan, and that's why in ESSA it kind of became the official policy of the Department of Education, and we believe it should be reflected in state law.
Representative Damon, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. So I'm fully respectful of the need for student privacy. I'm just looking for some comment on how our small, mostly rural districts that never meet that N of 11, how do we learn about test results and track what happens in those schools?
That's a really good question that I think we struggle with from a public transparency perspective, because if you have a grade of students that only has 3 students or 4 students in it in a very small, if we're talking about a K-8 one-room schoolhouse that has 30 students total across those grades, it's very difficult to publicly report any kind of results. All of that assessment data is made available to the school staff, to the school leaders, so they have the raw data. They use it in their planning purposes. They use it to make changes to their curriculum, to training that they provide teachers. It's just where we publish things publicly on the department website that data would be either blurred or suppressed because the n size is just too small.
Yes.
So is it ever aggregated across the grades? And I realize that's murky, but like you might have more than 11 students in a K-4 school, but not more than 11 per grade.
Yes. So we aggregate it both at a school and a district level. So if you had, 15 students even in a school, I mean, this would be a very tiny school, but even if you had 15 students in the entire school, you could see the school's performance publicly because that's more than 11. And then in the district, that might include multiple schools, and you would see the district performance as well. And that small school would be within that performance.
Further questions, Representative Myler?
Thank you. I should know the answer to my question, but define n size for me, please.
Sure. So n size, n refers to the total number of students in a particular group. And the group really depends on what it is that you're looking at from a data perspective. So an n size could be the number of students in third grade. It could be the number of students in the school. I think, when we talk about public reporting, sometimes where it gets tricky to report that out is student subgroups. So n size could refer to the total number of English language learners in a school or the total number of English language learners in a grade. Sometimes a school might only have 3 or 4 students that are English language learners, and it becomes difficult to report out on performance when the n size for subgroups of students are so small. We see that occasionally as well with special education for grades, where a small school might only have a very small handful of special education students per grade.
Further questions on this point? Good, we'll move on down the page then to lines 6 and 7, where there's a change here. The department shall provide testing entity as defined in the RSA with individual pupil names and unique pupil identifiers and other demographics and statistical information necessary to comply with state and federal reporting.
So we ran into, I'd say, 2 issues on one particular piece here. There is another statute, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's in the 180s, that allows the testing entities to collect specifically student name and date of birth. We needed a couple more demographic variables when we look at some of our larger testing vendors to be able to identify the correct students and make sure that we're sending the correct score reports to those students. And specifically, I can talk about the SAT. So the SAT is administered in every single state within the country. So when they're receiving test scores and test results, normally just within New Hampshire, a first, last name, and a date of birth might be enough for us to just identify a student. But when they're working with large amounts of data across multiple states, if they have more demographic information, they're able to make sure that each student is matched up with the correct score reports. So our intent with this change here is to make sure that we can share information specific to our students to make sure that the score reports we provide go to the correct student and to the correct parents of that child.
Representative Belcher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you just give us an example of what specific demographic data that would include?
So in this case, it's really just adding gender. And then in some cases, for some of the data analysis we do, it would be looking at ethnic or racial group.
Further questions? Okay, let's move on down to the line 17. The testing entity shall destroy all data on a schedule determined by the state contract with the testing entity.
So initially, the state statute said 8 years, and we were running into some problems there because we were having a difficult time identifying when the 8 years started and when it ended. And different students have different circumstances. So there are some students that get to 18, they graduate high school normally, they move on. There are some students that may stay in school until they're 20 or 21. In some cases, students that are special education students continue to receive services far beyond that. And so if you're destroying student data at 8 years, that can result in situations where a student came in third grade, and now we're destroying student records for students that are still within that school.
I see.
So we want the ability, and I think we'd welcome input from this committee, to develop a more comprehensive schedule for how and when student records and student data is destroyed that allows us to keep records in some cases, but ensure that our testing vendors are destroying records according to that schedule.
Yes, Representative Tanner.
I'm sorry to go back to the line 6 and 7, the demographic and statistical information. And you said gender and ethnicity are
Yes.
are the two, and why those two, unless the testing agency is using that as a kind of a not necessarily as a pupil identifier, but as an identification of scores that are within certain ethnic groups, maybe not doing as well as other ethnic groups. It just seems like if you wanted other pupil identifiers, it would be that they live in New Hampshire, that you'd have your unique pupil identifier and then you'd have an NH after it. Can you explain why that can't be as simple as that?
So for our New Hampshire specific tests, it is, and that's what we use. We don't really look beyond just first and last name and date of birth, and we have a New Hampshire identifier, and that's what we use there. We do internally use some of the ethnic and racial groups to look at the test performance, so that as we see the test performing for different groups of students internally, we may change different questions depending on how students are performing on it. And so that's all internal data that we use. None of that is published and none of that is used beyond the testing vendor. It's just for the creation of the test.
Is that data sort of like for ELL in like a city like a Manchester where you have a huge population which is speaking a different language or from a different culture? We get breakdowns on that information?
Yes. And our assessment vendor is the one that provides us with those breakdowns. They have the statistical information for the performance on each item. So they don't provide it for specific students. We're not receiving that student level data, but we get on average on the state, how did each different group perform on specific questions, so that we can determine whether we feel the questions themselves were written appropriately for New Hampshire students.
Representative Riley?
So on that very point, so that allows you to be able to disaggregate the data.
So we can do some of our own disaggregation of data when we look at overall performance. What we don't have the ability within the department to do is look at it on a question by question basis. So we just disaggregate when we look at overall student performance. So I think to Representative Ladd's point, we can do disaggregations and say how English language learners performed on the test as a whole, but we can't necessarily go in and look at how did English language learners perform on each of the individual questions across the test. And that's because we use an adaptive test. And so each student sees a slightly different version of the state assessment. And so it isn't as simple as just looking at how did everybody do on this one particular question. There are many different variations of each question that are worded in different ways. Sometimes the way a question might be worded presents challenges to students, and we go in and we look at it. Maybe it's too wordy versus some of the other questions that we use. And so that's the type of analysis we do to determine whether we feel the question itself is appropriate. And each year we throw questions out, we add new questions in to make sure that the test continues to assess appropriately what our students know and can do.
Representative Belcher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might have been a little bit confused. I want to dig in a little bit on what you were saying as far as using ethnic data as far as creating the tests. And you're saying that they're adaptive. Does that mean somehow we're administering possibly different tests to students based on ethnicity?
No, so it's entirely based upon student ability. So the way the adaptive engine works is a student will go in and they might answer a set of questions that's common across all students. And based off of how the students performed on those particular questions, if a student, aced every question, they move through those questions very quickly, the test will provide a slightly harder question to them next. And then if the student continues to perform well on those questions, the questions become increasingly harder. And you're able to determine the student's performance. If a student is answering questions incorrectly, it'll provide slightly easier questions to that student. And so that allows us to dial in exactly where students are at, entirely based upon ability. And we don't look at any student-specific information when we look at that. It's just how they're answering each question.
Yeah. If I may, just a quick follow-up, and thank you for that explanation, because that helps. But where does the ethnic component then come in? Because I thought you had said that somehow the ethnic part is used in the creation of the test. Is that right or no?
It's usually after the fact. So we have a federal requirement where we have to ensure that the way that students perform on questions is relatively similar. So if we gave a test, and I'll try to simplify it a little bit, but let's say there's 10 questions, and we looked at how students performed in different subgroups. So how your special ed population did, how your English language learner population did, how your free and reduced lunch income students did. And we found that specifically the free and reduced lunch kids overwhelmingly got question 8 wrong, but every other student group got question 8 correct. We would go in and look at that question and try to determine, is there something about that question that's causing one group of students overwhelmingly to get that question wrong? And that's the type of analysis. So we do that after the fact. It's once we have all of the data in. And then if we feel the question is appropriate and we look at it with groups of teachers, then it may stay on the test. But if we feel that particular question is unfair in some way to that particular group and maybe the way it's worded, then that question would be removed and we'd replace it with another question. But that would go on to the next year's test. And we have to do that for all of the questions for our test as part of receiving federal funds. So it's not public information that we put out there. It's something that we do internally when we look at how the test is performing. And then we provide evidence that we've done that analysis to the feds to show that we're looking at different student populations.
Representative Tanner?
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. If it adapts over years, would girls get different questions than boys? Or would the test be leaning more towards a male-identified test than a female-identified test, since gender is one of the things that you're taking into consideration as well as ethnicity?
No, so that is one of the groups that we would look at to see, if we had a question on there and overwhelmingly, let's say all the boys in the state got this question right, but all the girls got that question wrong. And we don't see that on the test, but if there was a situation where that happened, we would look at the question and try to decide, is this question in some way written that, it makes sense to boys, but it didn't make sense to the girls? And that's kind of a simplified way of looking at it. But the adaptivity of the test is really just based off student performance. So the test itself doesn't know who the students are. So it doesn't have anything to do with gender or any student groups.
So then I swing back in my mind, then why do we need to take those demographics? I mean, if it doesn't make sense to me that, I know why national tests do it, so that they can advertise and, target their tests more. But on a state level, I don't understand why we're doing that unless it's a federal mandate, which it didn't sound like it was a federal mandate. It sounds like we're just putting that in.
So in this case, it's a federal requirement. As part of our peer review, when we submit our state test to the U.S. Department of Education, they have to approve what we're doing in our statewide assessment. And part of that is we have to provide them evidence that we're doing that level of analysis. So that's where that comes in.
Okay, let's move on down to the next areas. We're leaving the assessment as identified in 193C and going into 193H, which is a little bit different here. Now we're talking about giving support to these schools which may need that support. So on lines, Nate, on line 24, there's a change by crossing out the date. And then I know why you're doing line 26, but why don't you go ahead and explain it?
Sure. So our plan occasionally goes through revisions. So we're trying to keep the date out because we have, the plan was updated in 2019, and then it was updated again in 2020 with some small changes we made as a result of the pandemic. And then we have a new revision that was updated and approved in 2023. So we're trying to keep the date itself out of statute just because the plan itself every couple of years has minor modifications and changes to it. Number 26, regardless of Title I status, this is just bringing, if you look at line 21, this whole sort of paragraph or section here is referring to comprehensive support and improvement schools. Later on in this statute, it also talks about targeted assistance schools, and it uses the same language regardless of Title I status. We think that that was an oversight of the original statute. CSI schools are actually the more serious of schools when we look at schools that need additional assistance. So when we talk about targeted assistance schools later on in the statute, and we add the piece about regardless of Title I status, we do the same thing for CSI schools as well. So I think, this is just bringing it into compliance with what our current practice is, and it matches it with the TSI schools. If we don't want to include non-Title I schools, I would recommend, not adding it here, but also removing it from the other section in statute where it already belongs. I think we either need both
put this
schools
in
or,
statute.
yeah,
And
well,
we liked it where we have some high schools which don't receive any title monies, but need help or are not, doing as well as they should, as good as they should. And so regardless whether they're receiving Title I money or not, they're not low as 5%, it's going to be identified and they're going to get that support.
exactly. Yeah, I would say this really applies to high schools.
Yeah.
Because there's just such a small number of high schools that identify as Title I in the state.
Yes, Representative Cascadden.
Just a quick question. I don't recall what does Title I use as their terminology for their rating? Is it the same, CSI and TSI?
It is. Yep.
Okay. All right. I couldn't remember. Thanks.
Going down to the next one now is line 27. Any high school with a graduation rate less than, you was 69% over 2 consecutive years. Now it's 67%, period.
So this is what's currently in our ESSA plan. So we had 2 different lists of schools. We had schools that were under 67% under the federal CSI definition. And then our state CSI definition here was 69% over 2 consecutive years. One of those lists receives federal funding and one of those lists does not. What we wanted to do was make the list the same so that when we identify schools as CSI, all the schools on that list receive federal funding. And then I know that Representative Lau, you and I had chatted about
We've
this.
had a real discussion on this one.
I think it's really important to understand that, we have a really high graduation rate in New Hampshire. Our high schools tend to do very well when compared nationally. We're in the low to mid 90s when we talk about graduation rates as an average for our state. But the way we define graduation rate, it's important to understand, is only students that receive a 4-year high school diploma. So this calculation here, this percentage, does not include students that receive their GED. It does not include students that take the HiSET and move on. It does not include students that are attending an adult education program and receive an adult diploma. And it does not include completion certificates as part of a special education program. So there are a lot of students that are successfully ending their high school program with a GED or a HiSET or adult diploma that don't count in this percentage. So when we say we might have a high school that has a 65% graduation rate, that just means 65% of their students received a 4-year high school diploma. Their completion rate may be much, much higher when you add in things like HiSET and GED and adult diplomas.
Okay, let me give you some figures that I looked up, and I'm looking at 4 high schools here. One north of us, Franklin, which has a graduation rate of 67.16% as of 2022, that cohort, with 1 student HiSET. Manchester Central has 67.97% graduation, 1 HiSET. Manchester West has 58.56% with 5 HiSETs, and Pittsfield has 53.85% with 1 HiSET. So we have some schools that are fairly low here. And I know that when we've had this discussion in other groups before, we've had senators really go off the track saying, why are we having this bar so low? Why aren't we setting the expectation at a level higher, wherever that may be, whether it's 75% or we know that our average is over 90%. So if we had these schools so low, how are we going to identify them through this process to get that support they need? Should we be identifying more schools? Because there's a number of them in the low, the low 70% level.
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we had looked at the numbers for this past year and looking at, if we increase it to 70 or 75%, if we increase it to 80%, what if you brought it all the way up to 90%? And obviously, as you bring that graduation target up higher, you end up with more schools on that list. What we want to try to do is find a balance between the amount of funds that we have and the number of schools that are on the list, because the funds are split between those schools. And so we want to try to identify the schools that need the most support when it comes to graduation. So we provide them the targeted funds that they need to put programs in place to try to raise those graduation rates. And I absolutely agree. We should set high targets. I believe our state target might be like 91 or 92% that we've set as our expectation is you should be hitting this or higher. The 67% or the 69% is the threshold for us to give you money specific to you trying to raise your graduation rate.
Representative Tanner.
Thank you. So I'm wondering how you determine graduation rate. Is it the number of students that enter high school that then complete their 4 years, or is it just the senior class? How many people out of that senior class do? And also, I'm concerned that the definition of high school. So is that a charter school that offers grades 9 through 12? Is it public academy? Again, are we putting all those groups in together? And I guess those are my two main questions with that. How's that percentage? Does it take into account that 200 kids are in 9th grade and only 67% of them graduate out of that high school? Does it take into account the kids that move out or that go to another school district, or whatever, they for one reason or another don't reach that 12th grade level?
So in terms of high schools, it does include charter schools and public academies as well.
Okay.
So across the board, if you're receiving any federal monies through the title program, you're on that list. We can certainly clarify that here in this statute. I think that would be good.
Okay.
You do post the academies and the charter schools on the web as well.
Right, and just as a point of clarification, so high school, elementary school, middle school, those are grade groupings. Types of schools would be a district public school, a charter school, a non-public school, whatever those are. So there's types of schools and school groupings. So a high school, no matter if it's a non-public school, a charter school, whatever, means a school that has 9 through 12 in it, kind of per our definition. So those are kind of a type and a grouping are different.
Okay,
so.
Thank you.
And then in terms of the way it's calculated, it's a cohort-based calculation. So as soon as a student enters 9th grade, they're assigned a year of graduation, regardless of what school they ultimately graduate from. And not to make it sound high stakes, but the clock starts ticking essentially. Once you're enrolled in 9th grade, you have 4 years to graduate with a regular high school diploma. And so when we're looking at the graduating class, we're looking at every student that entered 9th grade 4 years ago, and that's what we're using for our calculation to determine whether they're graduating or not. So a student who graduates with a regular high school diploma, but they do it 5 years from when they entered high school, does not count in this percentage. It actually dings a high school, and it drops their percentage. Even though they're still graduating and they're receiving a regular high school diploma, it's because they did it in 5 years instead of 4 years. And that's why for some of our larger high schools, you see lower percentages. They have students that are graduating, but they're graduating in their 5th year, or they might be graduating in their 6th year.
Wouldn't a school that had a high transient population then be also skewed, suffer from that as far as the graduation percentage?
It can. I think the schools that we see that suffer the most from the way it's defined tend to be the charter schools that are serving student populations that are most at risk for dropping out. We have a couple of charter schools that they are receiving students who are already entering their 5th year of high school. And so their graduation percentage will always be incredibly low, because by the time they receive that student will never count for them. They can't count as a 4-year graduate because they're entering the charter school in their 5th year. And then also we tend to see it skewing a little bit towards smaller schools, because if you only have 5 kids in your senior class and 2 of them don't graduate in their 4th year, your percentage is based out of 3 out of 5 students, and that significantly drops you. And those 2 students may still graduate. They may just graduate next year in their 5th year, but by then it doesn't count as part of that percentage.
Do you ever asterisk those so that when it's, publicized publicly, that it points out those facts.
Yeah, so we try to report this out in, I would say, about 4 or 5 different ways, and we talk to schools about different ways of messaging it to their community as well. This definition of students graduating in 4 years is a federal definition. We don't have an ability to control or define it, and that's because it's tied to federal funds. So the schools that fall below this 67% then receive federal funds directly to support their graduation rate. But on the website, we publish both a 4-year graduation rate and a 5-year graduation rate. And then we publish an average of a 4 and 5-year graduation rate so that parents and community members can go on there and see, okay, these are the kids that graduate in 4 years, but here's the percentage of kids that graduated within 5 years. And that 5-year graduation rate is always much higher than the 4-year because it captures those students that, maybe they repeated their freshman year twice or they repeated their junior year twice. But they're still on track to graduate. They just do it in 5 years instead of 4.
Representative Myler?
Tell us what the impact is of eliminating over 2 consecutive years.
So in this case, the 2 consecutive years is just part of the way it was defined at the state level. So that's not used in the federal definition. And so right now, the schools that meet this definition of 2 consecutive years don't receive any funds. The schools that meet the federal definition right now of just a single year do receive federal funds for their program. So that's why we talked about eliminating it here, because having a list that includes 2 consecutive years is a list that gets published, but there's no money attached to it because it's just within the state definition.
So by dropping this from 69 to 67, of those 4 high schools I talked about, you're eliminating 2 of them from receiving, because they're 67 point something, they're over that 67%. So is this a wise decision? Should we keep it at 69% where we currently are? We made that decision as a state. So we would allocate, I assume. We're not allocating the Title I money?
We can't because the federal law says 67%. So those ones right there in that grouping, they'd be identified for state purposes, but there's no additional assistance that we could provide them.
So we can't use Title I monies where they're got that rate?
We can only use title funding for where it aligns with the federal law, and where this would be we're currently right now out of line with the federal law. I mean, there's nothing to prevent you from coming up with a state program to support these additional schools. But right now, so all we would do would be identify those schools. We'd say, well, there's 2 of you, you get nothing. Everybody else, you get something because you do meet this federal criteria. So there's just kind of these 2 that'd be stuck in no man's land. We couldn't do anything to support
them. So we have in item B here, just above this area we're talking about, those schools which don't receive Title I support would be receiving, they'd be classified as a comprehensive support and improvement school. So, but we're not going to provide them any support?
So for the ones that do not receive Title I funding right now, that would only be identified for state purposes, there's no additional supports that we can provide them.
So we're just going to identify them that you're...
We agree that is a challenge that we should work together as a committee to resolve. But yes, that's right now there are, and I should say there's technical correction and action plans that are required later on in RSA. I think it's RSA 193E5 or something like that. That it's further down and it talks about there's essentially 4 years of potential corrective action plans that a school must implement, but there's no additional supports that the Department of Education is able to provide in the form of funding and or contracted assistance. So for the Title I schools that are in the bottom 5% schools that are CSI schools, we have contractors that we pay for with federal funds that help schools go out and they do a review, they do needs assessments for the schools, and they help the schools put plans in place to implement that. In addition, the schools also receive, we call it a 1003A grant from our Title I office at the Department of Education, and they receive I think it's anywhere from like $25,000 to several $100,000, depending on the size of the school, to implement those items identified in the needs assessment. So that's true right now. There is no additional state support for those schools.
So help me out here, Caitlin. So that the title, if you're considered a Title I recipient as a district, the district doesn't have the option to spend those dollars where they want, in which schools. It's
No, so there's two parts of Title I. So there's the big, large $40 million Title I grant that most districts across the state get, and the schools, the districts are required to provide those funds to their neediest students. So for the most part, schools rank order districts rank order their schools in order of poverty and allocate the funding out to the schools. So that's the big Title I grant. There's a set aside the Department of Education receives in Title I, which is 7% of our Title I grant. And so what we do is we take that money off of Title I off the top, and we set that aside for once the CSI determinations has been done. So we at the Department of Education do these rigorous calculations defined here in law to determine what the CSI schools will be, and those bottom 5% of schools will receive, one, the technical assistance, and two, a grant of that set aside grant. But that is only right now for elementary schools that are Title I status, or any school, any high school that has a graduation rate of below 67%.
yeah, Representative Cascadden.
Yes, so they would receive substantially as a CSI school or a TSI school if their graduation rate, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Not the ones that are 67.1. So in the list that you mentioned, I believe it was
Right,
West-
is below, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I believe
Below 67.
So have you been directing this money when we've had it at 69 for 2 consecutive years? Have they been receiving money?
no, we can't do that. So and I think part of the confusion is in 2017 we wrote this. We kind of tried to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, which we said, all right, there's federal accountability and there's state accountability. And it's mostly aligned, but there's a few differences, and this is one of those few differences. And we might be at a point now where we need to start talking about, well, what does state accountability actually look like? And should it be different than what federal accountability is? Because if you remember, the section of this law is accountability for inadequate education. And so maybe we want to say, all right, this is what you need to do over here per your consolidated state plan for ESSA. And that's while the, $130 million of federal ESSA money or whatever it is contingent on that. And then the accountability for inadequate education, which is the state adequate education funding of about $1 billion, maybe we have a different process for that. But right now, they're kind of aligned and there's some confusion. And there's a lot of people that have been coming to the Department of Education lately that said, well, should we be looking at completers? So should we be getting credit for those that are getting the kids a GED or a high set? Should there be some additional should that be included in your calculation? And we said, those are definitely good things to think about. We have our adult education program that's doing a lot of this work and paying for it on behalf of the state, but it's not included in the federal definition. And we don't have the ability to change the federal definition that's in federal law.
So approximately how much does West receive in Title I monies?
I can look it up, I think.
It'd be a lot.
But it'll take a minute, so if you want to move on from that point, then.
Okay, Nate, why don't we scoot down to the bottom part here and then come back to this. When you're talking about the New Hampshire Consolidated State Plan, and I know the definition there comes almost verbatim from federal law. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this just helps to provide some clarity as to what the ESSA state plan is and its purpose. One subsequent change as well in here is we removed every 3 years for that identification period and set it based upon a schedule set forth in the state plan. Initially, when the state plan was written back in 2017, the plan was to have that be on a schedule every 3 years, and that schedule was thrown into whack with the pandemic. We ended up with sort of a 1-year determination that occurred in the middle of the pandemic with a federal waiver, and then an additional 1-year designation, and then back to a 3 years. And so there was a schedule that was every 3 years based upon 2017, and that schedule kind of went out the window. So there is a schedule that is set down. It's approved by the U.S. Department of Education in our state ESSA plan. And so we just recommended here that we change it to be the schedule that's in the state plan as opposed to saying every 3 years. The goal is every 3 years. and that's what's written in the state plan. But the schedule's a little off as a result of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
To answer your question, West received this year $185,000. And that's in addition to other Title I money that Manchester
Yeah.
would have received several million.
So
several
then when
million.
we're looking at another school like Central, 67.9%, why can't the state kick in some money to help them as well?
There's absolutely nothing that prevents the state from doing that. You would just have to come up with a determination and obligate money in the state budget.
Okay. Further on that one. Okay, let's go to the last page here. Can you explain lines 4 through 7 for us, please, Nate? See, this is referencing back to the A.
Yes. So further down in this page, where it talks about, so on line 19, in current statute, it says any school that demonstrates and meets criteria established as a targeted support and improvement school pursuant to subparagraph A shall be identified as a school in need of corrective and technical assistance and subject to RSA 193E3E. So this, which is currently in statute, said that if you're a TSI school, you're subject to 193E3 and you're identified as a school in need of assistance, corrective and technical assistance. That language was not included as part of a CSI school. And CSI schools are actually schools that are worse in performance than TSI schools. So our current statute has a situation where we have two tiers. You have TSI and then below that CSI. TSI schools, by state law, are being identified as in need of assistance, but CSI schools were not. And so we felt like if you're identifying the higher level of schools as being in need of corrective assistance, you should also identify the group of schools that's in the lower tier because they actually need more support than TSI schools. And I don't know if maybe that was just an oversight in some of the original statute. I'm not sure what the intent was to identify a higher performing group of schools, but not the lower performing group of schools. So what we did is we just copied the language from 19 and we added up here in lines 4, 5, and 6 to the CSI schools. So now both of those groups of schools would be identified.
Even those not receiving Title I monies.
Correct. So this is relative to 193E3. So when you go back to the 193E3 statute, this is accountability for an adequate education. So what this is saying is you have two groups of federally identified schools. We're saying the higher performing group does not meet the requirements for an adequate education, but the lower performing group does. And that just didn't make sense within the statute. So we felt like if we're identifying one group as not meeting requirements for an adequate education, you really have to also identify the lower performing group as well, or take both groups out.
Further discussion on that? Okay, going down to middle of the page, line 18. Well, there's also some dates removed. I understand that. I think we should. Targeted support and improvement schools means, and I think this is just saying it's supported by our consolidated state plan.
Sorry, I think we're unclear what the question is.
Okay, I'm just, can you explain why they need to add in 18 there? On line 18?
Oh, sure. So this just matches the schedule of determinations of when we identify the additional targeted support and improvement schools to match the comprehensive support and improvement schools.
Okay. Yes, Representative Cascadden.
My question is on using the data from 2017-18. Is that when that classification first started?
Yes.
Okay,
So the very first list of CSI and TSI schools
Yeah.
was based off 17-18 data.
Okay.
And then future determinations are made based off of the current assessment data.
okay, question, thanks.
Yes, Representative Myler.
I'm sorry to be very basic here, but you use the term TSI and CSI. Which is the one that's higher and lower?
So a CSI school is the C stands for comprehensive.
Right.
And so that would be the lower performing one. That means that all of your whole school is performing in the very bottom 5% of the state across the board. A TSI school is a school that maybe the school overall is performing okay, but you might have one or two particular student groups that are performing in the bottom 5% of the state.
Thank you.
Representative Tanner?
And I think we've established before that it doesn't matter how high everybody is, there's still going to be a bottom 5%. It could be up at the 90th percentile, and if they were still at and that isn't understood by a lot of people, I think. And the same thing with proficiency, which we're going to talk about next. There's I think a lot of misinformation or misthought about proficiency standards. They actually move, and proficient doesn't mean that you're passing with a D or a C.
So, to your point about the bottom 5% always being identified, that is a requirement in the federal law. But that's a great question, and that's probably something that should be discussed as a committee, maybe going forward with some additional legislation, is if your bottom 5% is spectacular, do we want to say that those schools are not providing an adequate education by the definition? I'm not sure that we do or don't. So that would probably need to be written into law. And I think those were conversations that we always thought would be happening once we initially determined the list. So I think when we first came up with this legislation in 2018, 2019, we said, all right, well, let's get to the point. Let's do the determinations. Let's do the list. Let's look at what that looks like. And then now look what happens when we try to implement it. Now here we are 5 years down the road. We had 3 years of pandemic and quite a bit of educational disruption. And so we're kind of in this weird no man's land where we thought we would be coming back to you very shortly with an additional plan and some conversations, or especially with maybe the Legislative Oversight Committee. And it just hasn't happened yet. So that's partially why we're here.
Further discussion? Okay, on lines 27 through 29, you've got some crossouts there.
So this is a particular statute that's changed, I think, 3 times. Each time the dates have changed. So the line here requires that all schools ensure that every student is proficient on the state test by a certain year. Prior to it saying 2018-19, I believe it said 2015-16. Prior to that, I think it said 2008-2009. So there isn't necessarily a consequence attached to this line, and there's a date that's set. But we don't have every student scoring proficient on the state test in every school, and that's kind of what this line here requires. It says by this date, every student shall be proficient. So rather than continue to move the date down the road, we pulled it out just because there isn't something that happens afterwards. So we publish the data. We know that, many of our students are performing at various different levels on the state test, but there wasn't something that kind of happened next after determining that not every student was proficient.
Yes, Representative Dry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it says by that date, everybody had to be proficient, did they have to stay proficient? I mean, is it just like we hit it once and that was it?
It's kind of a vague statute, which is sort of why we crossed it out.
I think it's more than vague. Thank you.
It needs to be crossed out. Representative Damon.
Respectfully, Mr. Chair, I disagree. So we're crossing it out because we didn't have a consequence for not requiring students to perform at a proficient level. Don't we want them to perform at a proficient level? Maybe we should, if we're not achieving that, we should be addressing the fact that we're not achieving it, not taking away the goal.
No, I agree. I think, and in consequence is probably the bad word. I think, a next step based upon a stated year was sort of the part that didn't make sense is, okay, so we hit 2018-19, but there wasn't that next step of, okay, now what? And now we've gone beyond that. We're in 2023. This line is only specific to what occurred in the year 2018-19. And so that's the part that was, I absolutely 1,000% agree. And I think we have in both the purpose at the very beginning, I think, of 193C that talks about the purpose of the statewide assessment to ensure that all students are assessed on what they know and can do. We have, I think, as well within some of our rules at the department, and a lot of the communication that we put out, our goal is to get every single student to be proficient at grade level in reading and math and science. It's just this particular part that referenced that school year was a little bit nonsensical now that we're in 2023. Consequence is probably the bad word, to use.
But when we adopted the ESSA stuff back years ago, we were looking at the word growth as well as achievement. And so if a student is showing growth, but they're not at that proficient level yet for that student, but they're showing growth, that's our aim. That's one of our aims.
Yes.
So I think that we're going to say everybody's going to be proficient. That's not realistic, but we would like to see growth from all students.
And I think there's really important, the language that we use when we talk about proficiency. So, if I use fifth grade as an example, if we say that 45% of our fifth grade students, and I'm making up a number here, but if we say 45% of our fifth grade students are proficient in reading, we're not saying that 55% of our students can't read. We're saying that 55% of those students aren't proficient yet at a fifth grade level. Many of them are proficient at a fourth grade level, and they're making that growth towards that fifth grade level. The vast majority of those students can read, but in fifth grade, some of those students may be reading at a fourth grade level. Some of those students might be reading at a third grade level. So it's not, proficient doesn't mean whether you can do it or whether you can't do it. It's can you do it at that level that your age has put you at in your cohort. And so I think that's why we really like to talk about growth as well, because those students that are in fifth grade and reading at a fourth grade level may have made a huge amount of growth to get to that point. And so when we were publishing data and statistics on our website, next to the achievement percentages, we published the growth percentages to show what percent of students have made growth from their last school year to this school year. And maybe they're not on grade level yet, but they may have moved a whole grade and a half level up in growth in the work that they've been doing to get to the point they're at right now.
Representative Dry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it talks about the schools will meet performance-based indicators, this is in number 2 right now, approved by the Legislative Oversight Committee, where would we find those? It says it's in rules, so where are those standards?
So the statewide performance targets, we've always used the statewide performance targets that were approved in the ESSA plan in 2017-18. There was a committee that had been put together that developed the performance targets based off of how students in New Hampshire at each grade level had been performing up to that point. And it made projections out, I believe, for the next 10 years that were relatively aggressive projections for where we wanted students in New Hampshire to be in each of those subjects at each of those grade levels. And we published those targets on our website. So each year when a school receives the data around their statewide assessment, that data is compared to that statewide performance target. And they can see as a school, have they met what was expected for the state for that year? Did they exceed it? Were they below it? But much of that information is in the state ESSA plan.
Okay, follow up.
Yes.
So does that change? I mean, do the standards change, or we have to wait 10 years to reevaluate it?
So the standards themselves have not changed. The standards that we're holding students to each of those years are the same standards. When we get, I think, 10 years from 2017-18, which I think is when it's so 27, 28, we'll have to reevaluate and come up with new targets because we don't have any targets set right now at that point. But we do have a variety of targets for many different areas, not just the statewide assessment. We have graduation rate targets. We have targets for percentages of students mastering the English language learner that are English language learners. So there's a couple of other categories that go beyond just the statewide test. But yeah, they all end, I think, in 2027.
And we find those where?
So those are published on the I platform, in iReport, as well as in the state ESSA plan.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, this takes us down through the changes which we have here. It's a lot shorter than, now, if this is to move forward, this amendment then would delete everything in SB 266. And this would be 266.
So, and a lot of what we did in 266 was moving things around to make it chronologically make sense or just kind of move different areas. So that's a lot of why you have all these pages. So this gives us the ability to implement the law and do the work that we need to do. 266 gave us the ability to kind of make the law book look a little bit better. So
I don't know if we're, up to that in the next several weeks here to take this as it was introduced to us.
Right.
And
no, I think
wade
so.
through that.
I think if you move forward with the amendment, that gives us a lot of the work that we needed.
Yeah.
And then maybe we can talk about making some of the.
Well, I think we're open to that, but
through like a different bill or
don't think we're
something.
very
Yeah.
open
Yeah,
to
separately.
changing
Right.
CHKE.
Right. Yeah, and K was an entirely new invented.
I know that. It comes after J, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, to move the reporting, and we know that there's committees that are kind of mixed in this. There's the Holocaust legislation that was just kind of mixed in, and we thought it deserved its own section. So we were really trying to do an all for one. I guess maybe we got a little too ambitious with that work. So
We were kind of amazed that a bill of that size came from the Senate as introduced. No changes. That just was kind of shocking to me. And then when we got into it, we were waiting around, and I personally was trying to go back and forth. I know Jen Ford did a side by side here for us, and it was like it was a trial. And so I don't know. We're not there yet. I think we're going to have to take it step by step.
that's fair.
You're in some pretty heavy chapters there dealing with education. Representative Cascadden.
I want to commend you on this amendment in particular, because I've gone through, I think, 3 times and made notes on the side-by-side, and it was all over the place, and certainly some substantial issues in there that just didn't line up when you're talking about minimum standards for school approval versus criteria for education. So thank you for this. This is succinct. It's what we're talking about.
And we make that one change that
And
Linda came up
It's
with.
adapted.
And, my suggestion is that we make that one change as a committee right here. I don't think it's necessary to come back and talk 266 anymore. I would just as soon say we're satisfied to move forward with this thing with that amended change, and we'll have it as a committee amendment. Any objections to that, Representative Damon?
I have a lingering question before agreeing to that. So on page 3, line 31, and then it comes up again later, I think, where the amendment takes out the every 3-year determination of what schools are in which category. And I believe, Dr. Green, you said the goal is still every 3 years.
Yes.
So how do we know that stays the goal to reevaluate every 3 years if it's not part of the RSA?
So we have to set out that schedule to the U.S. Department of Education. I think that's sort of their expectation. Some states are on a 2-year schedule, but most states in the country are on a 3-year schedule, and that's what our current approved plan says. We had a few amendments that were in the middle of that created these 1-year kind of changes. We're back onto that 3-year cycle. So it's a standard 3-year cycle that we kind of match up with nationally.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any objection to moving forward with this amendment with that one change from the committee? So it looks like we're good. then we'll take action on this when we come back in November. And we should be able to move through this, and we'll get that one amendment made. It'd be a committee amendment. All righty, that closes us down. There is a meeting that starts at 1 o'clock, the teacher shortage committee meeting. So that's, I think that's over in the other building.
No, it's one.
Oh, 101 downstairs. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the afternoon. Thank you very much, Nate and Caitlin, for coming. Appreciate. Yeah.
So